A hush fell over the gallery the moment the bronze sculpture hit the floor. The crash rang out like a gunshot metal scraping marble, visitors gasping, and in the center of it all, Sam Carter stood frozen with the maintenance cart still in his hands. He hadn't touched the pedestal. Everyone in the room knew that, but the quiet, trembling voice of the museum's new board member sliced through the air anyway, sharp as ice. "Security," Linda Marsh said, eyes narrowing. "This man needs to be removed immediately." Sam didn't look at her. He was staring at the sculpture on the ground, a twisted figure of a woman in prayer. It had taken the artist 2 decades to finish. He felt every pair of eyes in the gallery press against his skin like judgment. He felt old shame rise in his throat, bitter and familiar. He breathed once, twice. He kept his voice steady. "The pedestal was loose," he said. "I warned your team last week. It should have been reinforced." Linda stepped closer, heels ticking against marble lips pressed into a thin, smug line. "I don't recall you having any authority to warn anyone. You're here to mop floors, Mr. Carter, not lecture curators." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The insult carried perfectly in the vaulted space. The guard hesitated, glancing between Sam and Linda, and then Margaret Caldwell entered the gallery. She didn't stride in or raise her voice. She simply appeared in the doorway as if the room reshaped itself to announce her. The CEO of Caldwell and Pierce Holdings had a presence that stopped conversations cold. Tonight she wore a navy wool coat over a deep green dress, her blonde hair pinned neatly, the faintest shadow beneath her eyes, hinting she hadn't slept much. She took in the scene with a single, sweeping look. "What happened?" Her voice was low, firm, controlled. Linda straightened, eager to take charge. "He knocked over the sculpture. And now he's deflecting blame onto the staff." She gave a small, triumphant smile. "This is why I've been advocating for better hiring standards. Incidents like this?" Margaret raised a hand. A quiet gesture, but it shut Linda down instantly. Her gaze fixed on the sculpture, then on the pedestal, then on Sam. She stepped forward, crouched, and touched the base. Her fingers moved gently like someone touching a violin they knew well. She felt the wobble. Her expression didn't change, but something sharp flickered in her eyes. "You sent a maintenance report about this last week," she said, still crouched, her tone factual, not questioning. "I remember seeing it." She stood again. "The pedestal was not reinforced. This is not on him." Linda's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "You can't be serious. He's obviously negligent. And he's been difficult since day one. People like him stop." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "You don't speak that way about museum staff. Not in my presence." Linda flushed crimson. "Well, maybe your presence is the problem. You can't expect us to maintain standards when you insist on hiring charity cases." The silence that followed was colder than winter air seeping through stone. A visitor shifted. A guard swallowed. Somewhere in the hall, a door clicked, and Margaret, usually composed, diplomatic, turned her head very slowly toward Linda. "Say that again." Linda stiffened, fighting the instinct to step back. "I said nothing untrue." Margaret took a single quiet breath. "You just insulted a man whose work keeps this entire building functioning, and you did it in front of guests, staff, donors, and artists. You will apologize." Linda let out a scoff. "Apologize?" To him, Sam had remained silent, watching, arms at his sides. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. He didn't want an apology. He wanted out of this room, out of the eyes, out of the humiliation he'd been dodging for years. But Margaret wasn't looking at him. She was still staring at Linda, eyes like polished steel. "Yes," Margaret said, to him. When Linda said nothing, Margaret added, "If you refuse, I'll personally request the board reconsider your seat. Poor judgment is one thing. Public disrespect is another entirely." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Linda's breath stuttered. She forced her expression into something resembling civility and turned to Sam. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "No sincerity, just compliance." Sam nodded once. Nothing more. Margaret dismissed the guard with a glance, and the crowd began to disperse, murmuring. But Margaret stayed where she was, her posture softening just enough to seem human again. She faced Sam fully. "Are you all right?" she asked. Sam exhaled slowly. "I've been through worse." She studied him, not pityingly, not skeptically, just studying. He seemed older, up close lines at the edges of his eyes, a quiet weight in the way he held himself. The kind of weight that didn't come from manual labor. The kind that came from something he never said aloud. "I know you filed the report," she said gently. "I'll make sure the department addresses the oversight." He shrugged, wanting to seem indifferent, but failing. "It's fine." "It's not fine," she said. "And I don't forget things like this." Her eyes lingered on him longer than a CEO's should. Something unspoken passed between them, an uneasy tension, a flicker of recognition she couldn't place. Before she could say more, a voice called her name from across the gallery. Richard Hale. Tall. Clean-cut. Expensive suit. A smile that looked polished for fundraising dinners. He approached with the confidence of someone used to owning every room he entered. "Margaret," he said, touching her arm gently. Too gently. "We're running late for dinner with the donors. Everything all right here?" "Handled," she replied, stepping back from Sam as if remembering where she stood. Richard nodded at Sam, offering a tight smile. "Tough break, friend, but accidents happen." His tone held sympathy, but his eyes carried the same appraisal as someone checking a used car for dents. He turned to walk Margaret away, but she hesitated. "Sam," she said quietly, "thank you for keeping your composure." He gave a faint nod before returning to the sculpture. He picked it up carefully, examining its damage. His breath caught. The fracture line ran clean through the arm. Repairable but costly. Footsteps echoed softly behind him. Someone else had stayed back. Emily, in her red winter coat, eyes wide with worry. "Dad, are you in trouble?" He crouched down so she could see his face. "No, sweetheart, not this time." He hoped the words were true. But as he returned the sculpture to the workroom, a strange feeling tugged at him. Margaret's voice, her eyes, the way she said she didn't forget things. He didn't know if it should comfort him or terrify him, because Margaret Caldwell didn't recognize him. But Sam remembered her. Every line of her face, every gesture, every note of a song she once loved before the world taught him how easily a life could fall apart. And somewhere deep inside him, something long buried stirred, whispering that this time the past wasn't done with either of them. Sam arrived at the museum just past 7 the next morning, the sky still gray with winter gloom, the streets half asleep. The freight entrance groaned open as he keyed in his code, the cold air biting at his face. He preferred these early hours, before the crowds, before the noise, before anyone could look at him long enough to remember the night before. He crossed the quiet service hallway, the hum of old pipes and soft buzz of fluorescent lights, greeting him like familiar ghosts. His boots echoed on the concrete floor as he pushed the maintenance cart forward, passing through the staff lounge where a radio whispered holiday music no one bothered to turn off. As he poured coffee into a paper cup, he heard footsteps and stiffened slightly. Then a voice he recognized. "Rough night, huh?" It was Tom Ellery, head of security, leaning one shoulder against the doorway. Tom was in his 50s, a broad man with a weathered face, gray whiskers along his jawline. He'd worked in law enforcement before taking the museum job, and he carried himself with the calm of someone who had seen more than he talked about. Sam nodded, keeping his tone light. "Could have gone better?" Tom snorted. "Could have gone worse, too." Margaret stepping in like that, Linda didn't expect it. You knocked the wind out of her pride. Sam stared into his coffee. "I didn't do anything." "Exactly," Tom said. "That's what scares people like her." He paused, studying Sam with eyes sharp enough to read what a man didn't say. "You all right? I'm fine." Tom didn't believe him, but he let it go. He clapped Sam's arm once and walked off, muttering something about making sure the security team documented the pedestal fault properly. Sam cleaned his cup, tossed it, and pushed the cart toward the gallery wing where the broken sculpture awaited his inspection. A thin line of anxiety followed him down the long hallway. Something in Margaret Caldwell's voice last night had unnerved him. The memory of her standing inches from the pedestal, eyes narrowing at the loosened screws, had dug up feelings he thought he'd buried 20 years ago. He didn't want the connection. He didn't want the memories. He didn't want her to recognize him, not now, not ever. He entered the restoration room, flipping on the lights. The bronze sculpture lay carefully cushioned on a padded table fracture clean across the forearm. He reached out fingertips, brushing the cool metal. A sound rose in his memory. Applause bright stage lights, his name being called before everything shattered into screams and collapsing rigging. He blinked hard, pushing the memory away. Behind him, the door creaked. "Is this a bad time?" The voice was soft, professional, but unmistakably hers. Sam turned slowly. Margaret stood just inside the doorway, coat still on gloved hands, clasped in front of her. She looked tired, as if the previous night had followed her into sleep. Or maybe she hadn't slept at all. "Ms. Caldwell," he said. His throat tightened, old habits choking his voice. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the sculpture before meeting his. "I spoke to the curator this morning. They confirmed the pedestal wasn't secured properly." Sam waited. She continued. "You were right to report it, and we failed to address it." She didn't sound angry. She sounded disappointed. In her staff, in the museum, in herself. "It's not your burden," Sam said quietly. "I'm used to things falling on me." She studied him, head tilting ever so slightly as though listening to something underneath his words. "That shouldn't be normal," she said. He looked away, pretending to check the fracture. "I'll repair the damage. It's salvageable." "That's not why I'm here." Her voice lowered. "Last night I sensed something unsettled you. More than the incident itself." He froze, hand hovering above the bronze. The air felt thinner. "I don't know what you mean." "You do," she said gently. His jaw tightened. "With respect, Ms. Caldwell, I don't answer to you. I work for the museum." "I'm not asking as your employer," she said. "I'm asking as someone who saw a man take blame that wasn't his. A man who looked like he'd been there before." He turned, then, meeting her eyes. They were steady, probing, too perceptive for his comfort. "Everyone has a past," he said. "Some of us learn to live with ours. And some of us spend years trying to forget theirs," she answered quietly. The words hit harder than they should have, too accurately. He opened his mouth to dismiss her, but a knock on the open door interrupted them. A young woman from the development office, Sarah Jennings, stepped inside, holding a folder pressed to her chest. Her eyes darted between them, sensing tension. Ms. Caldwell, sorry to interrupt. The board is asking if you can join their briefing call early. They're concerned about last night's incident being seen by donors. Margaret exhaled slowly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Of course they are. Sarah hesitated before adding, and Linda is already in the conference room. She's speaking to several trustees. Margaret's jaw tensed. About what Sarah swallowed. About you. The silence cracked like ice beneath weight. Sam shifted, watching Margaret's expression shift from surprise to cold calculation. Something sharpened behind her composure, a flash of steel. Not anger. Resolve. Thank you, Sarah, she said. Sarah nodded quickly and slipped out. Margaret waited a beat before speaking. Miss Marsh is well-connected and well-funded, she said. She makes noise when she wants to, and right now she wants to protect her ego by rewriting the story. Sam frowned. What does that have to do with me, everything she said? Because if she twists events to blame you, she strengthens her case and weakens mine. He studied her carefully. She didn't seem afraid. She seemed ready for a fight she'd anticipated long before last night. I don't want trouble, he said. Trouble doesn't care what you want, she replied. It shows up when someone else decides you're convenient. Her gaze softened a fraction. Let me handle this. But I need to know something first. Sam felt the distance between them shrink, like the room had tightened its grip. What she held his eyes. Why did you really look at me the way you did last night, as if you knew me? He steadied his breath, but it wasn't steady at all. She was too close to the truth. Too close to the past he'd spent years burying in silence and broken keys. He turned back to the sculpture, shutting himself off. You're mistaken, he said. Margaret didn't move, didn't speak. And then after a long moment, she said quietly, No, I'm not. The door closed behind her, leaving Sam alone with the fractured bronze, the humming lights, and a past he could no longer outrun. He pressed a hand against the table palms, trembling. He had hoped the world had forgotten him, forgotten who he used to be. But Margaret Caldwell had always been the exception, and now she was closer than ever to remembering. Linda Marsh was already speaking before the conference room door closed behind her. The sound carried through the glass walls, sharp and clipped, each word polished to pierce. She stood at the head of the long mahogany table posture, tall suit, immaculate, performing outrage like it was a monologue she had rehearsed all night. The museum's reputation cannot survive negligence like this, she said, sweeping a manicured hand toward the trustees. We are a cultural institution. Donors expect standards, and last night's incident proves we've fallen far below them. Several board members nodded with measured concern. Others exchanged wary glances. Only one person remained motionless. Charles Alden. The board chair, an aging philanthropist with a cane resting against his leg. His eyes didn't blink as he watched Linda, almost as if he were memorizing her every exaggeration. The door opened again, and Margaret stepped inside. Conversation fractured into fragments. Linda's voice faltered. Something shifted. The same way a room adjusts when a gust of wind sweeps in unnoticed until the temperature changes. Margaret removed her gloves, slowly placing them on the table with deliberate calm. I understand there are concerns, she said. Linda smiled tightly. concerns Margaret a priceless sculpture nearly shattered because of an employee who ignored basic protocol. That's not accurate, Margaret replied calmly. Linda tilted her head. Then enlighten us. Margaret didn't sit. She walked to the end of the table and rested a hand lightly on the back of a chair. The pedestal was unstable. The maintenance report submitted by Sam Carter stated that clearly. It was ignored. A murmur swept through the board. Linda let out a soft, incredulous laugh. You're placing blame on staff oversight. You're defending a man with no formal qualifications. Margaret. He's a custodian, not a conservator. For the first time that morning, Margaret's expression shifted. Not visibly. Just a tightening of the jaw, a subtle narrowing of the eyes. He's also the only person who took responsibility for reporting a hazard, and the only person who stayed calm during an unexpected failure. I won't allow his integrity to be weaponized against him. Charles Alden leaned forward slightly. Ms. Marsh, did you verify the report's existence before claiming misconduct? Linda hesitated. I was told by the curator. That's not an answer, Charles said. Linda's breath thinned. The curator was overwhelmed. The gallery was packed. Mistakes happen, and yet the only mistake you've chosen to highlight, Margaret said quietly, is the one that fits the narrative you prefer. A sharp, pulsing silence followed. Something about Margaret's tone made several trustees sit up straighter, as if realizing they were suddenly witnessing a shift in power they hadn't anticipated. Linda's eyes flashed with something brittle. Look at the situation rationally, Linda insisted. We cannot risk donor confidence. If word spreads that the museum is hiring at the bottom of the barrel enough, Margaret said. The word was soft, firm, final. But underneath it, something colder moved. Something almost dangerous. Linda's lips parted in shock. Excuse me? You're misrepresenting facts, Margaret said. And you're using a man's job to mask your frustration at being publicly corrected. That behavior has no place in this institution. You can't speak to me like that, Linda snapped. I just did. One of the trustees coughed to hide a smile. Another stared down at his papers, suddenly fascinated by the margin. Charles tapped his cane twice against the marble floor, a silent cue for composure. But the energy in the room had already shifted. Margaret stepped back from the chair. I have no intention of allowing misinformation to escalate. I'll conduct a review of safety protocols myself. And until that's complete, I expect no further accusations aimed at staff who followed procedure. Linda's voice dropped to a low hiss. Your judgment is clouded. By what Margaret asked, eyes steady. By fairness, by sentiment, Linda said. I saw the way you looked at him. The accusation struck the room like an unexpected gust heavy with implication. Several trustees glanced up, startled. Margaret didn't react, not a flicker. Only a slow inhale, steady and controlled. Be careful, Linda, she murmured. You're about to cross a line you won't recover from. Linda opened her mouth again, ready to strike, but Charles lifted a hand. Ms. Marsh, that will be all. Linda froze. But that will be all, he repeated. Her cheeks flushed a furious red. She snapped her binder shut and strode out, heels ticking with indignation. The door slammed harder than necessary. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Charles turned to Margaret. You handled that well. It shouldn't have been necessary, she replied quietly. A trustee on her left cleared his throat. This Carter fellow, should we be concerned? We don't know much about him. Margaret's gaze settled on him with quiet intensity. We don't know much about any staff unless we choose to. But what I do know is that he behaved with dignity when someone with far more power behaved without it. Another trustee asked, why was he even near the sculpture? Because he cares about this place more than some people who claim to protect it, Margaret said. Charles tapped his cane again. Then we stand by him. And we stand by you. Margaret nodded, once gathered her gloves and walked out without another word. In the hallway, she paused briefly, breathing in the crisp scent of polished stone and winter drafts. Her mind sharpened, running through calculations she didn't speak aloud. Something about Sam's reaction last night still clung to her thoughts like a faint melody she couldn't name. She wasn't a woman prone to sentiment. She didn't believe in coincidences. But she knew the look of someone carrying a story too heavy for their shoulders. Sam had that look. And now she wasn't sure whether defending him had protected him from Linda or had drawn him into something larger, something already shifting beneath the surface. As she walked toward the elevator, the museum below hummed to life. Visitors arriving, doors unlocking, lights flickering on. But beneath it all, Margaret felt something else awakening. A thread pulling taut between her world and Sam's, even though he didn't want it. Even though neither of them fully understood what waited on the other end of that thread. Not yet. But the past had a way of resurfacing, and it never resurfaced quietly. Margaret stepped out of the elevator into the quiet administrative wing, the muted carpet swallowing the sound of her heels. For a moment she stood still, letting the calm settle over her before the morning's meetings swallowed the rest of her day. But the calm didn't reach her. Something had been gnawing at her edges since dawn, a sense that last night's moment in the gallery had disturbed more than just a sculpture. She turned the corner and stopped when she saw Richard waiting outside her office, arms crossed, jaw tight. He pushed off the wall the second he spotted her. "We need to talk," he said. "Not now. Yes, now." She unlocked her office door and stepped inside. He followed without waiting for an invitation. The city stretched out beneath the window behind her desk, the skyline washed in pale winter light. She hung her coat, keeping her back to him longer than necessary. "What is it?" He moved toward the center of the room, the tension rolling off him sharp enough to grate. "You embarrassed yourself this morning, and you embarrassed me." She turned slowly. "How so?" "You defended a custodian in front of the entire board. You went after Linda like she'd committed a felony." Margaret took a breath, steady and controlled. She lied, and she blamed the wrong person. Richard laughed under his breath. "You're too smart to get tangled up in emotional nonsense. You're letting this situation distract you." "It wasn't emotional," she said. "It was he insisted." "You looked angry, Margaret. Personally angry. And all over a man who should have been reprimanded, not protected." She stared at him for a long moment before answering. "You weren't there. You didn't see what happened." "I saw enough afterward," he snapped. "Half the museum staff is talking about you stepping in to play hero. It's not a good look." "Hero," she repeated, voice flat. "You know how these things go. Optics matter. And if you're going to lead the next round of donor negotiations, you can't afford to appear soft." Soft? The word landed like a cold hand against her ribs. She lowered her gaze briefly before lifting it again, eyes clearer, firmer. Defending someone from false accusations is not softness. Richard exhaled sharply, pacing once, across the office. "We're supposed to present ourselves as a united front. And I'm tired of being blindsided when you make decisions based on your feelings." There it was, a flicker of disdain beneath the polished tone. Margaret felt her pulse steady anger thinning into something colder. What I did was right. The right move would have been to let it go, Richard said. Let Marsh rant. Let the board believe what they want. They don't need the truth. They need stability. She folded her hands in front of her, a gesture that made Richard pause. Is that how you operate? Ignore the truth when it's inconvenient? He hesitated a fraction too long. She nodded once. Quiet understanding, quiet disappointment. I don't have time for this, she said. I have a full schedule and a museum to run. Is this about him? Richard asked suddenly. She blinked. What? The custodian, he pressed. You're acting differently. Protective. Emotional. It's not like you. She stared at him, unable to decide whether to laugh or be insulted. No, Richard. This isn't about him. It's about leadership. He stepped closer, too close. Then prove it. Before she could respond, her assistant appeared in the doorway, cheeks pink from rushing. Margaret, sorry, but someone from the donor relations office needs you. It's urgent. She nodded and moved past Richard, brushing lightly against her assistant's shoulder as she exited. The hallway felt cooler than her office air, sharp, clean. Her assistant swallowed nervously. One of the major donors came in early for the private tour. They asked for you specifically. She followed her assistant toward the North Wing mind, splitting between her responsibilities and the heavy feeling building behind her sternum. Something about Richard's words clung to her, not because they were true, but because he believed them. She pushed through the staff door into the museum corridors. The winter light from the skylights cast long beams across the polished floor. Visitors weren't allowed in yet, but preparations were underway. Voices echoed faintly from the distant galleries, radios crackled, carts moved, and somewhere beyond all that, the faintest piano chord drifted down the hallway. She stopped walking. Her assistant noticed the shift. Is everything okay? Yes, Margaret murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. Go ahead. I'll be a moment. Her assistant hesitated, then hurried off. Margaret followed the sound down the hallway, each note clear, soft, and painfully familiar. She reached the door to the practice room and pushed it open, just enough to see inside. Sam was seated at the piano, fingers moving slowly over the keys. Not performing, not rehearsing, just touching the music, as if testing a memory to see if it still lived. She watched him for a moment, breath caught somewhere between curiosity and something she didn't yet dare name. His shoulders rose and fell with each breath. His posture held a quiet dignity, nothing like the defeated man from last night. Here, in the warm morning light streaming across the piano, he looked entirely different. Not a custodian, not a man who blended into the background, someone once trained, someone once brilliant, someone once lost. He stopped playing abruptly, sensing her presence without looking. His hands stilled on the keys. How long have you been standing there? He asked. Long enough, she said. He turned his head slightly, not fully facing her. I wasn't disturbing anything. It's fine, she said. The music sounded familiar. He didn't answer. She stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. You play well? Not like I used to. His tone was quiet, not bitter, just honest. She moved closer, careful, watching how tension rippled along his shoulders. Why did you stop? He took a breath long and slow, because someone else was listening. Something about that answer tugged inside her. You don't like being heard? She asked. Not anymore. He finally turned, meeting her eyes for the first time since the board meeting. There was a question in his gaze, and a warning, and something older than pain. "Sam," she said softly, "what are you afraid I'll recognize?" His jaw tightened. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with." "Then why does it feel like there's more between us than last night's incident?" The air held still. He looked away first. "You don't want to know," he said. "Maybe I do." Her words hung in the quiet room, warm and unyielding. Sam stood pushing the bench back with his knee. He reached for the piano lid, lowering it with surprising gentleness, as though closing a chapter he wasn't ready to revisit. "Whatever you think you see," he said, "you're mistaken." She stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I am." His breath faltered, just slightly. Enough for her to notice. He walked past her toward the door before she could say anything else, but right as he reached it, he stopped, hand on the knob, shoulders tense. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "Of what?" "Of people digging for answers they're not prepared to find." He left without turning back. Margaret stood in the empty practice room, the last note he'd played, still vibrating faintly in her memory. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition. Margaret found herself moving faster than she meant to, heels striking the museum floor with a rhythm sharper than her breath. She didn't know where she was going. Only that distance seemed like the only thing capable of quieting the pulse hammering beneath her ribs. But the building was waking around her, staff voices rising, carts rolling, radios crackling. Everywhere she turned, the morning pressed in. She stopped near the mezzanine railing overlooking the atrium below, gripping the cool metal edge. The vast space echoed faintly with preparations for the private donor tour, but her mind stayed trapped in the small practice room in the way Sam had stood when he realized she was listening in the flicker of recognition he tried and failed to hide. She whispered to herself, not meaning to speak aloud. "What happened to you?" A voice answered from behind her. "Should I be worried that you're talking to railings now?" She turned to find Charles Alden approaching, leaning slightly on his cane. His tailored overcoat hung open, revealing the navy vest he favored for morning meetings. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes carried that calm, seasoned sharpness she'd learned never to underestimate. "You're early," Margaret said. "I heard the board meeting ended energetically." He studied her face, noting the subtle tension around her eyes. "Walk with me." She didn't argue. They descended the staircase side by side, Charles taking each step with measured caution, while she matched her pace to his. The museum's main hall stretched ahead, banners for the upcoming winter exhibit fluttering gently with the draft. "Linda won't let it go," Charles said. "You know that?" "She doesn't have to," Margaret replied. "I'll handle it." "I'm sure you will," he said, though something skeptical threaded his tone. "But that's not the question I meant to ask." She waited. "Why did you defend him so fiercely?" The honesty of the question startled her. Charles stopped walking, leaning on his cane, turning slightly toward her. "If I didn't know you better," he continued, "I'd say you've taken a personal interest." Margaret kept her voice even. "I don't appreciate people being punished for telling the truth." "That isn't new," Charles said. "You've always fought for the principle. But yesterday, there was something different in your voice." She inhaled sharply. Different. How Charles studied her for a long moment, seeing more than anyone else ever did. Like you recognized him. Her breath caught. Only for an instant. But long enough. Charles gave a slow nod as if confirming a theory. "I see." She bristled. You're reading too much into this. Maybe he conceded. Or maybe you're refusing to admit what your instincts already know. Before she could protest, a group of staff members rounded the corner and greeted them, forcing both to step back into the rhythm of formality. Margaret walked ahead, leaving Charles behind as though distance could undo his words. She didn't get far. Her assistant hurried toward her, clutching a tablet. Margaret, the donor representative, has been waiting. They moved to the restoration gallery. Fine, she said. And her assistant added nervously, Ms. Marsh has joined them. Margaret exhaled slowly. Of course she has. She walked toward the restoration gallery, her stride steady, her expression composed, though something sharpened behind her eyes. When she entered, she found 4 people gathered near the sculpture Sam had been repairing. Linda stood beside the lead donor, Miles Hoover, a real estate mogul, with silver hair and a handshake that always lasted a beat too long. His wife, Judith, hovered near the display case, soft-spoken and observant. Margaret approached with a calmness she didn't feel. Good morning, everyone. Miles turned, smiling broadly. Margaret, just the woman we wanted to see. Linda here was filling us in. Margaret's stomach tightened. About what Linda's smile was sweet as varnish, about the incident. Miles was understandably curious how such a valuable piece could be mishandled. Margaret stepped closer. The pedestal failed. No one mishandled anything. Miles chuckled. That's not what Linda said. It's the truth, Margaret replied. Judith Hoover looked up at her sharply, as if measuring the tone beneath Margaret's words. She drifted toward the sculpture eyes, tracing the fracture line that had been stabilized with resin overnight. Her voice was soft but clear. Who repaired this? Margaret hesitated. One of our maintenance personnel. He has experience with artifact handling. Linda cut in quickly. Experience he's not trained. He had no right touching a piece of this value. Judith frowned. It's a clean interim repair. Whoever did this knows what they're doing. A brief silence followed. Margaret held her ground. Miles glanced between them. All I care about is ensuring the museum is run with discipline. Donors expect stability. Margaret answered, and stability requires truth. Not scapegoating. Linda stiffened. Judith stepped closer to Margaret, her eyes thoughtful. What's his name? Margaret paused. Sam Carter. Judith nodded slowly as though storing the name somewhere precise. I'd like to meet him. Linda's face tightened. That's hardly necessary. Judith lifted her chin. If someone saved one of our collection pieces from a worse fate, I'd like to thank him. Margaret felt heat rise in her chest, not anger this time, but an unexpected sense of vindication. I'll arrange it, she said softly. Linda forced a laugh. Margaret, you're not seriously elevating a custodian in front of enough. Judith said, surprising everyone. Her voice was gentle but firm, like someone accustomed to being underestimated, until she chose not to be. Respect is not a luxury to be rationed, Ms. Marsh. Linda blinked, stunned. Margaret kept her expression composed, though inside something shifted, subtle but seismic. An ally she hadn't expected had emerged. But that shift lasted only a moment because another voice came from behind them. Am I interrupting? Sam stood in the doorway. He held a small restoration kit in one-hand coat, still dusted with winter snow. His eyes swept briefly across the room, landing on Margaret for a heartbeat before moving to the donors. Calm, steady, completely unaware, he had just entered a room where his existence was now the center of the storm. Margaret felt a breath catch in her chest, not because he was out of place, but because deep down beneath fear, beneath curiosity, beneath 20 years of buried truth. She already knew this moment was going to change everything. Sam stepped inside the gallery, unaware of the tension lingering like static in the air. He set the restoration kit on the table, his hands steady, even though the room felt too full, too quiet. Margaret watched him, every movement measured, every breath carefully drawn. She couldn't shake the sense that he was walking into something he didn't realize had already begun shaping itself around him. Miles Hoover clapped his hands together lightly. "Ah, you must be the man of the hour." Sam froze for half a second, then turned toward the donor with practiced restraint. "I'm just doing my job." Judith Hoover stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "You repaired the fracture on this piece." Sam nodded. "Stabilized it. Full restoration will require a conservator." "It's impressive," Judith said. "You have training?" Sam held her gaze for a beat, then answered simply, "Some." Margaret felt something tighten inside her. Not the answer, the pause before it, the way he seemed to weigh how much of himself he was willing to reveal. Linda seized her opening. "He's being modest. His role is custodial. We do not encourage untrained staff to interfere with. He didn't interfere." Margaret cut in voice calm, but edged with steel. "He prevented further damage. Something no one else here thought to do." Miles laughed lightly. "You two sound like a television courtroom drama. Let the man breathe." Sam shifted under the attention. "If you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish the assessment before the gallery opens." Margaret opened her mouth to intervene, to redirect the conversation, but Judith spoke first. "One moment, Mr. Carter." She walked closer, her eyes kind but perceptive in a way that made people hesitate before lying. "How long have you worked here? 3 years. And before that, Sam's breath caught. Just for an instant. Barely noticeable unless someone was watching him closely. Margaret was. Different jobs, he said. Wherever I could find work." Judith nodded slowly. "Well, I'm grateful you were here last night." "Truly." He gave a small nod. "Thank you." As he turned back toward the sculpture, Linda stepped closer to Margaret, voice low, acidic. "You're creating a narrative around a man you don't even know." Margaret didn't look at her. "Better that than destroying one to protect your pride." Linda flinched as if struck. She recovered quickly. "This isn't over." "I'm sure it isn't," Margaret said. The Hoovers moved toward the exit with a curator leaving Margaret and Linda alone for a sudden heavy moment. Sam continued working intentionally, silent. When the donors were out of earshot, Margaret finally turned to Linda. "If you attempt to undermine the staff again or misrepresent any events related to this incident, I will request a formal review of your position on the board." Linda's eyes widened, shocked that she dared say it aloud. "You wouldn't." "I would," Margaret said. Linda's expression hardened into something sharp and personal. "This is about him. Whatever he is to you." Margaret took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You're looking for a motive to justify your own behavior. There isn't one. You crossed a line. And now, you're facing the consequence." Linda inhaled through her teeth. "You'll regret this." "No," Margaret said. "What I will regret is wasting another minute on this conversation." Linda turned and walked out, her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor. As soon as the echo faded, Margaret exhaled slowly and turned her attention back to Sam. He worked in silence, carefully applying resin with steady hands. She approached him hesitantly, unsure whether she was interrupting or intruding. "You handled yourself well," she said. He didn't look up. "I didn't do anything." "You stayed calm," she said. That's not nothing. Sam paused, then set down the applicator and finally looked at her. Why are they all suddenly interested in me? Because Linda wants someone to blame, she said, and because the Hoovers are curious about anyone who shows talent. He considered that jaw tightening slightly. Curiosity can be dangerous. So can silence, she replied. He dropped his eyes back to the sculpture. I prefer silence. I've noticed. She expected him to tense or retreat or shut down. Instead, he surprised her with a quiet question. Why are you defending me? Because you look like someone who spent too many years bracing for the worst. Because you carry something that hasn't healed. Because I saw you once before and never forgot. She didn't say any of that. Instead, she answered, because what happened wasn't your fault. And I don't tolerate injustice. Sam studied her closely. There's more to it. He said it with certainty, not accusation. It rattled something inside her. Is there? She asked. You tell me. Their eyes locked. Neither looked away. Neither moved. Then someone knocked on the open door frame. Margaret Charles's voice carried gently into the room. A word when you can. She stepped back from Sam as Charles entered. His gaze flicked between them, reading the air in half a second. He hit it well, but not well enough. Margaret walked toward him, but before she left the room, she glanced back. Sam was already working again, shoulders bowed over the sculpture, shutting her out as if he'd practiced it for years. Charles waited until they were in the hallway before speaking quietly. You should be careful. With what? With him. He paused, choosing his words. He isn't just a man who had a hard night. There's something under the surface. I know, she said. And you're still stepping closer. She didn't deny it. Charles sighed. Just be sure you're ready for whatever you're walking toward. Some pasts don't stay buried. She looked through the glass toward the gallery where Sam stood alone, the winter light falling across him. I don't think his ever truly did, she said. And the truth that scared her most wasn't that Sam was hiding something. It was that a part of her instinctive, unexplainable already recognized whatever it was. The museum emptied slowly that afternoon, the winter light fading into a blue-gray hush that pressed against the glass walls. Closing crews moved through the corridors with quiet efficiency, stacking stanchions, dimming gallery lights, locking cases. By 5:45, only a skeleton staff remained, and the building felt heavier as if holding its breath. Sam preferred it that way. Fewer eyes, less noise, more space, to think without feeling the world pressing against him. He knelt beside a supply cart in the east wing, sorting tools back into their drawers, when a voice broke the stillness behind him. Is now a bad time? He didn't look up right away. He closed the last drawer, carefully wiped his hands on a rag, and then turned. Judith Hoover stood a few feet away, bundled in a camel-colored coat, her hair swept back in a low knot. She held a leather-bound notebook to her chest, her face calm but serious. Not a social visit. Sam straightened slowly. Ma'am, I thought your tour was over? It was, she said. But I asked someone to take me to wherever you might be working. She paused. I hope that's all right. Sam nodded once. What can I help you with? She studied him for a moment, taking in the worn edges of his clothes, the neatness of his tools, the tired steadiness in his eyes. You have experience with restoration. It wasn't a question. He hesitated. Some. I've been reviewing the fracture repair you did, she said. Most people wouldn't see the choices you made, the way you aligned the join, the way you balanced pressure points. That requires training. He shifted his weight. I've picked things up over the years? That's not what I'm asking, she said gently. I'm asking where you learned it. Sam felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to retreat behind silence. It's complicated. Everything worth knowing usually is. He exhaled slowly. I worked in restoration a long time ago. Before the accident. Judith's eyebrows lifted just slightly. Accident? It doesn't matter anymore. She didn't press him. She didn't change her tone. She didn't soften into pity. Instead, she spoke with the quiet clarity of someone used to navigating lives far more complex than her own. Mr. Carter, I've spent years supporting museums and artists. I've met people who embellish their skill and those who hide it. You? She tilted her head. You're the second type. Sam said nothing. Judith stepped closer. Do you still work with your hands because you love it or because it's the only thing left that feels familiar? The question dug deeper than she knew. Sam's jaw tightened. He looked away. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed down the hall. Margaret's voice followed crisp but softer than usual. Mrs. Hoover, I wasn't expecting you to still be here. Judith turned, offering a warm smile. I wasn't ready to leave. Margaret glanced between them, a flicker of concern crossing her eyes. Is everything all right? Yes, Judith said. In fact, I think you've underestimated one of your employees. Margaret stiffened. What do you mean? Judith nodded toward Sam. He's not who you think he is. A silence fell, layered and electric. Sam's shoulders hardened tension, drawing up his spine. Mrs. Hoover, please. This isn't speculation, Judith said. It's observation. He handled that sculpture like someone who once worked in conservation or artifact preservation. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. She looked at Sam, waiting for confirmation. He didn't give it. Judith closed her notebook. Talent is a rare thing, and when I see it, I don't forget it. Margaret drew in a slow breath. Sam, is she right? He swallowed. Parts of it. Which parts? That I worked with artifacts before. His voice was steady but guarded, quiet but firm. That's all. Judith watched the exchange with a faint knowing smile of someone who understood more than she said aloud. You're not obligated to share everything she told Sam, but don't hide from people who are trying to help. Sam didn't respond. Judith pulled a card from her notebook and handed it to him. My foundation supports training programs for underrepresented conservators. If you ever want to re-enter the field, Sam shook his head before she finished. Thank you, but I'm not looking to start over. Judith didn't withdraw the card. She held it steady, patient. Humor me. After a long, reluctant moment, he took it. She smiled once softly, then turned to Margaret. You have good instincts. Don't let people like Marsh convince you otherwise. Margaret nodded. Thank you. Judith walked down the hall toward the exit, the sound of her heels fading until silence settled again. When she was gone, Margaret faced Sam fully. You worked in restoration, she said. Not accusing, not demanding, just truth-seeking truth. Yes. Why did you leave? He paused, jaw tightening. Accidents happen. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Sam, if you're worried, I'll judge you. I'm not worried about you. He cut in. She blinked at the sharpness, at the way it concealed something fragile underneath. He stepped back, creating space. Don't push this. She held his gaze. I'm not pushing. I'm trying to understand. You don't need to. But I want to, she said quietly. That stopped him. Not the tone, the honesty. For a second, neither of them spoke. The faint hum of the building filled the silence, the smell of dust and winter air settling between them. Then Sam said, "The past has a way of punishing people who dig in it. Only if they're digging in the wrong places. You're digging in mine. And you're afraid of what I'll find." His breath hitched, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for her. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something old flickered in his eyes. Recognition, memory, pain. She stepped closer without meaning to. He stepped back, deliberately. "Please," he said, voice low, "let it go." She took another breath, steadying herself. "I can't." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with the resignation of someone who knew the ground beneath him had shifted, and there was no undoing it. "Then you're headed," he murmured, "straight into a story you don't want to hear." Her voice softened. "Try me." Sam didn't answer. He simply walked past her, the card from Judith, still trembling between his fingers, and disappeared down the dim corridor, leaving Margaret standing alone in the fading winter light, aware for the first time that whatever tether bound their histories together was no longer subtle, no longer silent, and no longer willing to stay buried. Sam didn't go home after his shift. He walked. Blocks and blocks through the winter air, collar up, hands buried in his jacket pockets as the cold bit through the seams. He didn't know where he was going. Anywhere that wasn't his apartment felt safer than sitting alone with the thoughts clawing at him. Streetlights flickered across his face as he passed them, each one illuminating a new angle of the exhaustion he carried. When he finally stopped, he was standing outside a shuttered music shop. The window displays were dusty, the instruments inside barely visible in the dim light. But a single upright piano near the back still held shape in the shadows. Keys, chipped, wood cracked, waiting. Sam stared at it, a faint ache stirring behind his ribs. Once he had stood behind pianos like that, with certainty, with purpose, with a future he believed wouldn't be taken away. He moved on. By the time he reached his apartment, it was nearly 7:30. A warm glow flickered in the front window. He stiffened. Someone was inside. He unlocked the door slowly and stepped in ready for anything. Emily ran to him. "Dad, you're late." Relief softened him. He knelt to hug her. "Sorry, kiddo. Long day." A voice came from the kitchen. She insisted on waiting up. Sam stood as his neighbor Mrs. Porter appeared holding a casserole dish. A widow in her late 60s with a sharp tongue and a soft heart, she'd helped watch Emily since Sam moved into the building. She wanted dinner. "You weren't home, so I brought mine over," she said, setting the dish down with practiced authority. "You didn't have to," Sam said. "I know," she replied, "but I did." Emily tugged his sleeve. "We made cookies, too," Mrs. Porter huffed. "We attempted. Half the batch is cold, but she's enthusiastic." Sam managed a smile. "Thank you. Both of you." Mrs. Porter saw more than she ever said. Her eyes lingered on him, narrowing just slightly. "You look like you've been hit by a truck." "Just tired," Sam said. "That's what you always say." She wiped her hands. "Eat, sit, pretend you're not carrying the weight of the world." Emily beamed. "Dad never pretends." Mrs. Porter raised an eyebrow. "All adults pretend." Sam spent the next hour pretending to be fine as he listened to Emily chatter about her day at school. But when Mrs. Porter returned to her apartment and Emily finally fell asleep on the couch, one of her new drawings still clutched in her hand, the silence returned thick and suffocating. He carried Emily to her bed, kissed her forehead, and turned off the light. Then he sat at the kitchen table, Judith's card lying in front of him. He stared at it for minutes that felt like hours. Sam Carter. Underrepresented Conservators Program, full scholarship available. He closed his eyes. He heard applause, felt stage lights, smelled dust from the collapsing scaffold, heard the snap-wood bone future. His hands trembled. He shoved the card into a drawer and closed it. He wasn't going back. He couldn't. A soft knock at the door made his head lift sharply. No one visited him at night. He opened it a cautious inch. Margaret stood on the landing. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, a gray wool coat wrapped around her shoulders, breath visible in the cold. She looked different than she had in the museum, less composed, less polished, as if she had walked straight from her thoughts to his building without stopping to reconsider. He opened the door wider but didn't step aside. "How did you find where I live?" She hesitated. "I asked the museum's manager. I told him it was a work matter." He didn't like that answer. Something flickered in his eyes. "This isn't appropriate. I know," she said. "But I came anyway." He didn't move. Why, she swallowed, fighting her own uncertainty. "Because you walked out without letting me finish." "There was nothing left to finish," he said. "There was," she insisted. "And you know it." He blew out a breath, glancing back toward Emily's room. "You shouldn't be here." "I won't stay long," she said. "Just let me say what I need to." He stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him so Emily wouldn't wake. They stood on the narrow landing overlooking the courtyard, cold air drifting between them, streetlight glow catching on drifting snow. Margaret drew in a careful breath. "You said I'm digging in places I shouldn't. But you're wrong. I'm not digging. I'm recognizing something. I'm not who you think he said." "I don't think anything," she replied. "I feel something, and I want to understand it." His jaw clenched. "Understanding comes with consequences. So be it. You don't mean that." She stepped closer. "Sam, look at me." He didn't. His eyes fixed on the parking lot below, on the distant headlights passing through the street. "Years ago," she said softly, "I knew someone who carried himself the way you do. Someone who looked like the world had taken more from him than it ever gave back. Someone who disappeared after an accident that never should have happened." He closed his eyes. Hard. Her voice cracked. "I never knew what happened to him. I never got answers. And now, I'm looking at a man who's stopped." His voice cut through the cold air. She froze. Sam opened his eyes and turned toward her, expression rawer than she had ever seen. "Whatever you're reaching for," he said tightly, "leave it where it is." "Why?" "Because the truth won't give you what you're searching for." "And what am I searching for?" "Redemption," he whispered. "Forgiveness. Closure." She inhaled sharply. "You can't get that from me," he said. She stared at him, breath unsteady. "Then tell me what I am supposed to do with this feeling." He shook his head. "Let it pass. It won't. Make it." Their breath mingled in the cold, turning white and fragile between them. She stepped even closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you to me, Sam?" He didn't answer. He turned away, gripping the railing as if steadying himself against everything he had spent years burying. "I can't do this," he said. "Then tell me," she whispered. "Tell me why." He opened his mouth, but the sound of a door opening downstairs interrupted them. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Sam stiffened instantly. Margaret followed his gaze. A man stood below looking up at them. Richard. Hands in his coat pockets. Expression unreadable. A shadow hovering beneath the street lamp. Richard said nothing. He didn't need to. The look on his face told Margaret everything. He knew where she was. He knew who she was with. and whatever patience he had left was gone. Sam stepped back from the railing, eyes hardening. "This is exactly what I meant," he murmured. "Consequences." Margaret felt the cold wind cut deeper than the winter air. For the first time, she understood Sam wasn't just hiding a past. He was warning her about the future. Richard didn't move at first. He just stood there in the courtyard, head slightly tilted, watching the two of them on the landing, as if he were piecing together a puzzle he thought he already knew the shape of. Snow drifted around him in slow spirals, catching in the collar of his coat. When he finally stepped forward, the gravel under his shoes cracked through the cold air like breaking ice. Margaret felt her pulse shift slow and heavy, like the silence before a storm. Sam stepped back instinctively, not from fear, but from calculation. The shift in his posture was subtle, the way an animal listens more closely when it recognizes a predator. Richard reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up. "So, this is where you go at night," he said, voice carrying, clear and calm. "Too calm. Funny. I always thought you were harder to predict." Margaret forced herself to breathe evenly. "Richard, why are you here? Why am I here?" He laughed under his breath. "A better question might be, why are you?" Sam didn't move, but his eyes hardened, watching Richard the way someone watches a flame too close to a curtain. "This isn't your business," Margaret said. Richard's gaze cut to her sharp as a blade. "Everything concerning your reputation is my business. You're a public figure. You run a museum dependent on donors who pay attention to every headline. And here you are, alone, with him." Sam didn't flinch, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flash of old humiliation quickly extinguished. Margaret stepped forward on the landing, meeting Richard's stare head-on. "I'm not your property, and my time outside the museum is not a matter for your approval." Richard smiled slightly, but it never touched his eyes. "You don't understand. Do you people watch you? They talk. They build narratives. And narratives destroy people far more efficiently than facts ever could." Sam said quietly, "Leave her out of this." Richard finally turned his full attention to him, and the temperature around them seemed to drop. "Leave her out of this," Richard repeated as if tasting the words. "You really think you're in any position to offer instructions?" Sam didn't answer, but the stillness in him changed. He straightened, shoulders squared just slightly. Something dormant flickered behind his composure. Margaret felt it too, a tension taut and alarming humming between the two men. Richard placed one gloved hand on the stair railing. "People like you," he said, "cause problems, not because you try, but because you exist in the wrong places." Richard, Margaret snapped, "That's enough." "It's not enough," Richard said softly. "Not yet." He climbed one step, then another, slow, deliberate, a man who believed he had nothing to fear. Sam didn't retreat. He shifted just enough to angle himself between Richard and the apartment door. Protective, instinctive, and not subtle. Richard noticed. His eyes narrowed. "Well," he said, "that's interesting." Margaret moved to step between them, but something in Sam's expression stopped her. He wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He was bracing, as if he'd done this before. Richard reached the top of the stairs. His breath frosted the air between them. "You think she's here for you?" Richard asked. "That she sees whatever it is you're hiding?" Sam's jaw tightened. "This conversation is over." "No," Richard said. "It isn't." He took one slow step closer. Margaret felt panic spike through her, not fear for herself, for the dangerous clarity in Sam's eyes. "Richard, go home." "I will," he said, "after I finish what I came here for." "What is that?" Sam asked, voice low. Richard smiled faintly. To remind you both how easily lives collapse. Margaret stepped forward. Richard! He turned to her. You have no idea who he is. And you do, she shot back. Richard paused, and in that pause, something shifted. He wasn't shocked, he wasn't bluffing, he wasn't guessing. He knew something. About Sam. Something he hadn't said aloud. Yet. Margaret felt her stomach drop. What do you mean by that? Richard looked past her straight at Sam. You think you could hide forever in this neighborhood, in that job? From people who actually bother to look, Sam's breath stilled. Completely. In all the years Margaret had known him professionally, Richard had never looked more certain of anything than he did now. I did a little digging, Richard said. After our conversation at the museum. Margaret's voice cracked. Richard, what did you do? He didn't answer her. He answered Sam. You changed your name, Richard said quietly. Did you really think no one would find the original one? The world seemed to freeze. The air, the snow, the space between heartbeats. Everything held. Margaret stared at Sam, searching his face, looking for denial. Explanation. Anything. He didn't blink. He just breathed out once. Slow. Controlled. A man accepting that a piece of the truth had finally surfaced. Richard stepped back, satisfied. Your past, he said, is not as buried as you think? Margaret's voice trembled. Sam, what is he talking about? Sam didn't answer, not because he wouldn't, because he couldn't. Richard turned to leave, coat-brushing snow off the railing as he descended the stairs. Oh, he added, without turning back, and Margaret, if you continue tying yourself to him, you'll go down with him. He disappeared into the darkness. The courtyard fell silent except for distant traffic and the soft hiss of falling snow. Margaret looked at Sam, shaken to the bone. Your name? Is it true? Sam closed his eyes. The truth he had fought for 20 years to outrun was no longer at the door. It was standing in front of him, and Margaret was waiting for an answer. Snow fell in soft sheets the morning Sam walked into the museum for the final hearing. The board had chosen a closed session, citing operational privacy, but he knew what it truly meant: fewer witnesses if things went wrong. Margaret walked beside him in composed silence, her coat brushing his with each step, her breath steady but shallow. She had barely slept since the truth began unraveling, and neither had he. They entered the council room where Charles Alden sat at the head of the long table, hands folded over his cane. Several trustees were already present. Some avoided Sam's eyes, others watched him openly curious or wary. Linda Marsh sat near the far end, a thin smile carved across her face, and beside her, Richard leaned back in his chair with an air of quiet victory. Margaret took her seat, but didn't look away from Sam until he sat beside her. You're not alone, she murmured. Not today. Charles cleared his throat. We're here to discuss allegations regarding Mr. Carter's identity and employment documentation, as well as the handling of last week's incident. His gaze swept the table. Let's proceed with respect. Linda stood immediately. Respect is fine, but truth is better. We have before us a man who falsified his work history and concealed a legal name that carries liabilities we've only begun to uncover. Margaret rose before anyone else could speak. Mr. Carter did not falsify anything. His legal name was changed lawfully 20 years ago after a traumatic accident that ended his previous career. There is no crime, no misconduct. Only a man rebuilding his life without dragging others into his past. Convenient, Richard muttered. Margaret ignored him. If we start punishing employees for surviving tragedy, we cease to be an institution of culture and become an institution of cruelty. Linda lifted a file. If his past is so benign, he can explain it himself. Dozens of eyes turned to Sam. The air grew tight, thick, expectant. Sam felt the familiar urge to retreat into silence, but when he looked at Margaret, something steadier rose in him, something that felt like resolve. He stood. My birth name was Samuel Whitaker. He began, voice rough but clear. When I was 19, I worked in artifact restoration. A scaffolding collapsed during a museum installation, and I was pinned under the weight of a suspended frame. I survived, but my partner on the project didn't. His family blamed me. The press blamed me. And I blame myself. A ripple of discomfort moved around the table. There was no criminal negligence. Sam continued. Investigations proved that. But the story didn't matter. The narrative did. I couldn't stay under that name, so I changed it. I took my mother's surname. I left the field. I tried to disappear. Linda crossed her arms. And now you're back in it, meddling in repairs, hiding in plain sight. Sam met her stare. I stabilized a sculpture because if I hadn't, you would have lost a museum piece. I didn't do it for attention. I did it because I still know how. Judith Hoover, seated quietly near the corner, rose now with surprising force. This board should be ashamed. You have a man with talent, humility, and a past shaped by tragedy, not deceit. You want a villain. He isn't one. Richard scoffed. So we excuse anything because the donors like him? Judith's eyes flashed. No, because it's right. Charles tapped his cane once a sharp sound. Mr. Carter, have you ever posed a risk to this institution? No, sir. Have you acted with integrity since the day you were hired? Yes. Charles looked at the board. That is what matters. Not his name. Not his scars. Linda tried to object, but Charles raised his hand again, silencing her. This discussion is concluded. Relief washed through the room, slow but powerful. Margaret closed her eyes for one brief moment, the tension leaving her shoulders in a quiet exhale. Sam sat down, the weight he had carried for 2 decades, loosening at last. As the meeting dissolved into side conversations, Richard approached Margaret with a stiff expression. You won this round, he said. She stayed seated, her voice low. There aren't rounds anymore. You're finished here. His jaw tightened, and he stormed out without another word. When the room finally emptied, Margaret turned to Sam. You didn't have to carry all of that alone. He gave a small, tired smile. I didn't know anyone would care enough to help me carry it. She held his gaze, warm, steady, unafraid. You were wrong. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softening the world into something quieter, something gentler. As they stepped out into the winter air, Sam felt, for the first time in years, the possibility of a life not defined by loss, but by the people willing to stand beside him. If you want more chapters like this, remember to like, subscribe, and comment the 3 words, keep moving forward.